Kraak, thanks for having me, guys. I work at Oath. Anybody know what Oath does? No. Yeah. Anybody know what AOL is still?
Yeah.
Anybody know what Yahoo is?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So Verizon came in and saved both of them, and 50 other brands. TechCrunch, Autoblog, what else? Just tons of them. They're all under the brand umbrella of Oath now. So yeah, the last major acquisition was, I don't know, a year ago, where Verizon acquired Yahoo, and that's when they had to figure out, right, you know, what are we? Are we AOL? Are we Yahoo? Are we, you know, 50 million other things? So they created this umbrella brand that really doesn't do anything, it just houses those other brands. And then we constantly get the joke, obviously, I was hired at AOL, so, you know, what, do they still send out this, or like, can I still get dial-up and all those kind of things? Yeah, they don't. We work out of a pretty large office down in Canton, in the city, on Boston Street, you know, where the Starbucks is right there. They call it the Can Company. It's a larger building, it's an entire third floor, so it's over 100 people. Baltimore has always been a hotbed for advertising. So you may know advertising.com was born in Baltimore, and they all got kind of swallowed up, and Millennial Media was there, they all got swallowed up by AOL at some point or another. But that's what we do there, programmatic advertising. So you know, they're everything. They have, it's divided into supply and demand. Obviously they do a lot of content generation, like, you know, Yahoo Finance is huge. I don't know if you use any Yahoo stuff. I personally don't, but I'm told Yahoo Finance is pretty big. Yahoo Fantasy Sports is pretty big. So there's a lot of content there, and like they produce that content. On the other side, they try to monetize it and have ads running on them. So we directly work on a large web application, specifically that any advertiser, most large advertisers like airlines, Best Buy, large companies go in and just run their ads through that applications, and they have several of them. As you might imagine, there's a lot of scale there. That's why I went there in terms of data. You know, they crunch a lot of data, and they serve a lot of ads very quickly around the globe. When I started, we used Angular 1, and then when Yahoo came into the fold, Yahoo was big on Ember. So we recently, 6-8 months ago, we had to make the switch, the entire team from Angular 1 to Ember. So as you can see, not everybody's using React. Most people are, but you know, I personally, that's why I'm here tonight, really don't. I try to not get involved as much in those framework wars. I mean, those for you probably. That's what, and for everybody in the JavaScript community. I don't know how involved you are. You know, that's what you hear. You know, what should I use? You know, is it Angular? Is it Vue? Is it React? Is it, you know, Ember? You barely hear anymore because, you know, it's still around. It's nowhere near as popular. You know what is popularity? But that's what you hear. I try not to get involved. I try to focus on JavaScript as the language itself. Obviously, day to day, I have to. You know, any sizable web app, you know, you're not going to use plain JavaScript, but it certainly helps. It certainly helps to know the language itself. Any whatever language it is, you know, it's the same in Java. I don't know much about Java. Hopefully, you guys can educate me. But there's the little I know is there's frameworks just as much. You know, Spring Boot and all the stuff that I get thrown around. I work with, you know, we work on small teams with API guys that talk about these things. So it's the same kind of an idea. But especially in the JavaScript world, you know, they talk a lot about these types of things as opposed to the language itself. And I also been teaching a front-end course at Betamore, you know, the little incubator in the city for 3 years, where I just teach people 3 times a year for 10 weeks how to build a website with, you know, touch anything from markup to CSS and JavaScript. And there, so you know, we were at the point where people start they want to come in and start learning React, right? We're at a point now where they don't even know, like, oh, it's all JavaScript, right? They talk about it in such a way that, and that just tells me that, I don't want to use the word OI, but it is a lot. And obviously, it's just an abstraction, right? And then it's great. It does a lot of magic for you. There's a reason why these things exist, and any sizable app should probably use them, whatever it is. But what I tell people who learn JavaScript, you can use once you go deeper on JavaScript, you can apply that to any framework that comes along, and it's not very uncommon for people to having to switch like I did. So once you know the underlying thing, it's whether you like it, whether you may especially Ember is very opinionated, right? Whether you like it or not doesn't really matter. If you have a good base, you can pretty much roll with that. So that's why tonight I took a small piece off JavaScript, and I just trying to enlighten you. Hopefully you learn something, and that is types and values. It's not going to be long. I only got a handful of slides, got a couple of code samples. Somewhere along the way there, I would have loved to make the comparison to Java, because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is that still what's mainly taught in higher ed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there any, how does it, so tell me, is there any JavaScript? Is it part of a web dev specialization or anything at all? Or
when I was in high school, when I took our web development class, we started out HTML and then moved to JavaScript, and that was it.
There was nothing here though at all.
There's an elective called for web. It's like an elective, and I think they use the mean stack.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's also a web programming class where they teach JavaScript towards the end of the semester.
So it's like a pass.
However,
Yeah.
However, the core coding language here is Java. They do have an introductory course with C++, but mainly everything revolves around Java.
So computer science
Yep.
concepts, and data structures, all that is taught with Java.
Yes.
Correct.
Structure and object-oriented Java.
Yeah. Okay. And that's been for quite a while, right? Do you have any of you guys have any experience with JavaScript outside of this?
Yeah.
Yeah. On your own, you do something?
On my own, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any special motivation for that? Did you just?
I wanted to get into mobile development, such as Android Studio, and most of the time I had to code within JavaScript there. Also, I've used Visual Studio Code, and I'm also learning. I had to learn Angular for a class I'm taking now.
Okay. Yeah, that means starting or mean or learn. Yeah, if they do, yeah, still be Angular. And just in general, as you know, like any Stack Overflow year-end survey, JavaScript, or even number of stars on GitHub, most popular language, JavaScript is is always it is as popular for a reason, especially since we have Node. So the idea for me is most people probably come from the front end, starting with JavaScript, but then now with Node, or you can take it anywhere. You can build mobile apps. You can do anything. It's not always. Should you always? Probably it's not. Sometimes probably not. It's probably advantage to just go straight to native Objective-C or whatever, or Java back or whatever the Android stuff is built in. But JavaScript as a community or as a language is just very vast and has whether it's open position or anywhere, it's pretty big. A little more about me. So I'm fully self-taught. I don't have what you guys are about to get, hopefully at some point. I don't have a formal computer science, anything here, anything, all the web stuff I've taught myself. Not that really matters. It's just it's less formalized. But I at the end of the day, once you start a job, you pretty much have to kind of do the same thing. So and team-wise, I'm around people that have graduated from here or anywhere else. And others like me who just taught themselves all the time. Fortunately, the demand is so high at the moment, or probably for the foreseeable future, that it doesn't really matter. Okay, let's get back to we have 4 types. In JavaScript, we have null, empty value, usually not auto assign, right? You do that explicitly in code. You want to have a variable. You know later on it's going to hold a value, but for now, you just put null in there as kind of an empty placeholder. We get and it's it's a data type and a value, so it's data type of null, and it has exactly one value, and that is null. And we have undefined, pretty much the same thing. Any variable that you do declare and you don't assign, usually, right, probably the same in Java. At the time of declaration, you assign a value most of the time, but if you don't, then it's undefined. And you don't assign that, right? The JavaScript engine automatically puts the value undefined in there. Booleans, you know them, true or false, make a decision. Numbers, we got strings, any type of characters, literals, one or more. Objects, very vast, especially in JavaScript. And new with ES6 or ECMAScript 2015, we got symbol in there as well. So we have 7 here. 7 built-in types. Usually, let's see. All of them, all of these, so 6 out of 7 are what we call in JavaScript primitives. All of them are primitives except for object. Primitives are immutable. You can't change them. You can copy them, obviously. But they're all primitives. And the subtitle for tonight is also, there's always this, I Googled it earlier actually, and it came right up, is everything in JavaScript an object? And already at the first slide, we know it's not, right? We have a lot of different objects, but not everything actually is an object. We will, in about 10 minutes or so, we'll find out where that comes from, where that confusion often comes from, that people think everything indeed is an object. But we have the type of operator. So you can do this, in your browser. Obviously, you can just open Command Option I on the Mac, pop open the developer tools and run any of this JavaScript. Use the browser as your hosting environment for JavaScript to run any of this. So here, we also have 7 strings that type of returns. Undefined, Boolean, number, string, object, symbol, and function. So you can use the type of operator. Yeah, you feed it a value, and it'll tell you what type it is. Easy enough. And it's always a string that gets returned. But already here, you can hopefully tell there's some confusion already. What is that? Anybody know? So we have 7. We looked at 7 built-in types, and then we have 7 strings that that the type of operator returns. But what's the problem? Or what is possibly a point of confusion? They don't right? They don't quite line up, right? So we have undefined, yep, there's a type for that. There's a type for Boolean, there's a type for number, there's a type for string. Object, symbol, we already saw that. That's a big type of confusion. Null does not return null as a type of, it returns object. Tons of stuff online, what is it? It's just a bug that will never get corrected because so much code around there relies on it. But it literally is an oversight or a very early bug in the language that should return null. It does not return subject. And you can go way deeper in that, why that is and how you can properly detect null. But it is what it is, and it will most likely never get corrected.
So, for the number type, does that include like integer, double, all those? And
Yes,
one?
yes,
Okay.
yes. That's another thing. So that's, I should have said that. We're actually not gonna look at the ins and outs of every single one of them. That would be another, one of those talks for one of those weeks. But yeah, in JavaScript, it's integers, it's all across the board. Yeah, and that's different from Java, right? Is it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. No, of course. So we have, most of them do map to one of these. Not all of them do though, and that, right? So that's an outlier we just talked about. Here's another one. Functions. This gives you somewhat of an illusion that it's actually a top level type, but it's not. But it does come back as function, which is very valuable. I was just working on something the other day where I had to know whether something is a function. And you can reliably use the type of operator to check for that. Now there was a period when there was an issue in IE or Safari somewhere, like it always usually is, but most modern browsers will now reliably, it's as simple as that. Feed it an object if you want to have a little utility function that gives you that, but it returns function. And on the bottom here, we have a simple array of numbers, and that returns object. Coming from here to here, you might expect, why doesn't that return our array? Right? So they don't quite match up. To get in here. What is that? Yep.
Oh, is there like some sort of collections? If we want this, I guess array.
Yes, arrays. There's tons of there's sets, there's maps, there's objects, there's all kinds of types of collections. So here we go again. So that leaves us with two main things. Either you have a primitive, or you have objects. Still not quite out of the woods. We'll see in a minute. But at this point in time, and these are small. There's a small selection of built-in objects like math, like JSON. And then if you these two, only if you're in the browser environment, you get window, you get document. If you're running something in Node, obviously that's not available to you. But any other object you create, so that's a small selection of built-in objects. But the underlying type is an object. So if you were to run type off on any of these, you always get get options. So that's good to know in JavaScript. Either you're dealing with a primitive, or you have objects. And lots of these are specialized objects actually. So now there's function again. That's what we call them specialized objects, object subtypes. So if you run type off on any of these, except for function, right? Be careful. But that doesn't mean function actually. See, that's the confusing part. Type off kind of gives you the illusion it is, it is its own built-in type. We already know it's not. It is just as much an object, a special type of object, just as array is, or data is, or arrays, or JSON, or any of these. You can only have either primitives or objects. And these are just, under the hood, these are just special type of objects. Let's look at some code. Since array, let's do a little detour. Since array and function are so common, right? And let's start with arrays. So the first is not an array, it's just a simple object, which is an object literal. But once you're, when in my class, when I introduce newcomers or anybody, to programming, well, yeah, it's pretty obvious that what the difference is. So how do you start? You start with syntax. You have an object up top, and then you have an object of person, and then an array of colors. Key value pass at the top, and just indexed values for arrays. So you can see you access the keys differently. You got dot notation to get at the name there. That's very, very different than getting at a certain index in an array. You just call it out by its index to get access to any of these. So how are they related? Again, they're both type of object. They're just specialized objects. The array is, that's a straight up object, and that's a specialized object. The first time where it gets weird is, okay, you're telling me it's an array, but then I can still use the dot notation to get at a property such as length. I can still use the dot notation to get at a method, just like push. So how, I thought it's an array. So how, am I back in object land? I seem to be, right? So that's the first time where some of that confusion might come in. And you can do crazy stuff like this, right? We're still looking at the colors array, and I can just add a property to it. If you check the length of it, it's still going to give you 3. See if we can do this. Let's blow it all up. Let's see. So we add it. Does it give me access to it? Let's see, color settings. Colors is not defined, okay. Get you back here. Get me down. Can't. Red and blue, white, red. Now it should work. Okay, 3 elements in the array, that's all cool. If I then come along and I say colors dot mix and make that another string, I can do that. It's not very practical. I've never done this in practice, but it kind of, what I'm driving at, it kind of proves that it is an underlying object, that arrays are just special objects. Okay, so if we recall the length, it's still only 3. Right? It does not add. But if we look at colors now, it certainly has added our mix property to it, but it treats these values quite different. Right? You can push to them, you can get the length of them. The entire data structure is built around indexed values. So it's a special type of object that knows how to deal with indexed values. But doesn't mean you can add a property to it, which kind of gives, hopefully makes somewhat more clear that it is, at its birth, just an object. And then here, we can iterate over properties in an object with the for in loop. So, and we do that, we iterate over colors. If it wouldn't be an object, we wouldn't be able to do that. Let's see the props right there. You can see the colors right there. See if I can drop that into the console real quick. There we go. So now, as opposed to length, right, this will actually get every single property. And as you can see, it's still an object that just has indexed, and it you know, it's meant to work with all of these. But at the end of the day, it still gets you all the properties of an object, and the loop works just fine because the array is just a specialized object. Special treatment for indexed values. That's really it. Functions are probably way more confusing than that, right? I can wrap my head around, okay, I just did this small exercise, and the whole idea is to wrap my head around that these are all just specialized objects. How the hell is a function looks completely different than any object, like any object literal. How is that related or even? You're telling me it is also an object. Well, there again, right? You can get a length. You can run. You can access the length method or the property, not method, property right on a function. And for a function, it will give you the number of arguments. That's what length will give you. But there again, you're using dot notation. You can call the call method. Right? That'll execute the function. I don't know how much you know about, I do believe you do have it as well. You have the this value is very much all over JavaScript. So call is just a method on any function that lets you explicitly set the this value as opposed to using the default one. In this case, I don't care about it, so I just gave it null. But if you were to execute that, right? So if you have this function, let's see if we can put that in there real quick. So if we have this function, obviously we can easily call it like any other function. 1, 2 should give us 3. Then we can certainly do sum.call, and then I'm not interested in setting a special rule. So if I do 5 and 6, I get the sum. It executes the functions in the same way. But again, I have a method on a function, and the whole idea why we're doing this is to illustrate or wrap our heads around the fact that these are indeed objects. What helps is, I think, just to illustrate that, this is to use the constructor instead of a literal. So that's a literal, and here we actually have built-ins. We'll get into that in a minute. We actually have built-in constructor functions that the language provides that you can also use to create your function. So it's the same thing, right? So the constructor with the new keyword accepts 3 arguments. First one is the first argument of the function, the same as this. Second one is this. And the third, all strings, is actually the body of the function. And you will never, on line 13, I've never seen anybody, and it's actually discouraged to do that and to create a function like that. It does the same thing as this, it has a different name. But the only reason we're doing it here is just to wrap our head around again that this actually, it illustrates nicely that it is actually an object. Let's see here real quick. I have another one over here. You hear a lot about that in JavaScript. First-class functions. What's that? First-class citizens. Functions are first-class values. What does that actually mean? Once you understand that they are objects, this should be clear. Once you have an object, or once you know, it's easy to wrap your head around that you can assign an object to a variable, right? But beginners, or even it took me a long time to figure out that I can just treat functions as any other value. And once you take that middle step, I think, to learn that these are objects, I think it becomes more obvious. And all this means is first-class functions, first-class objects. You hear it a lot. You can assign variables to a function. You can store a function in an array or an object like any other value. They're no different. In the beginning, if you're being introduced to functions, they seem very, very different. Looking at the syntax from the outside in, they seem very, very different, but they're not. And then once you go to the last two, right? I don't know if anybody has ever looked deeper into functional programming style versus classes and inheritance. It's just different types of programming. That's where this stuff really shines, right? You constantly pass functions to other functions, and you certainly return functions from functions. But even going all the way crazy into functional style or whatever, passing functions to function, you do that literally. I do that in my class for very beginners. The minute you open add event listener, right? The second argument is a function to. First argument is what event you're listening to. The second argument is a function, so it's right there. You don't have to go all the way into functional stuff to see that in JavaScript. that a function gets passed to a function. That is very, very common, especially for callback style things. You know, asynchronous, you know, we now have promises and all that, but simple events, getting people used to that, it's very, very common in JavaScript. Is it as much in Java that you can pass functions to functions? Is that the same kind of thing, or is it very different?
You could pass functions and functions.
Yeah.
On
Is it commonly done, or
on exams?
that's just an exams kind of thing?
Nah,
or
it's-
not a practical kind of thing?
Depends for organization issues.
In JavaScript, right, you've probably done it, you know, literally hundreds of times. Like it's not an exotic kind of off the thing over here. It's literally very common to do that. But in the beginning, right, I know it's probably even for you guys. You know, I teach lots of beginners, so I have to, you know, force myself to like back up, and you know, I'm very much interested in all. So hopefully, I get some of this out of tonight. It's like, well, how do you explain some of these things, right? Over time, when you do this, whether you learn or over the job, you kind of you learn, right? But putting that in layman's terms, so to speak, like that's usually why I do these things as well. Like finding, that's the biggest thrill for me. Finding good ways to illustrate these concepts is a totally different side of the coin usually. But again, how did we end up here? Well, we're trying to figure out how can we become better friends with the idea that functions are objects. And once you know that, then you can take the next, then this stuff, all these 4 points should not be that foreign anymore. And again, we tried here, we tried just to use the function constructor to just illustrate that. So that's another, we can spend all night on, you know, the new keyword. New keyword always returns an object right there and there. So if there is such a function constructor in the language, then they kind of must be objects always.
When you add a constant, does it could be lowercase? Like the syntax, like the word for the constant could be lowercase, the variable?
So you mean like
where it says
constant
add, yeah.
and sum? Yes. So in JavaScript uses, or by convention, nothing forces you. By convention uses camel case. So if I had two words, it's always going to be lowercase first word, and uppercase is always uppercase second word. But since I only had one short word, it's lowercase. Yeah.
Nice. I just wasn't sure because like in C++, when you declare a constant, it's supposed to be capital or whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, see, that's deceiving as well. I mean, this came with ES6. You know, we always used to have the var keyword to declare a variable in JavaScript up until 2015. It's always just var. There's one way to declare a variable. Now we have var. It didn't go away, and we have let, and we have const. More confusion here, right? I hate to call it a constant. Yes, 90% of the time it is. The idea is you will never reassign. So you use const to replace all your vars. You still need to know var because you're looking at all the code. There's not going to be any sign of constant or constant let. It's going to be var everywhere. But var has shortcomings that they try to address, that they did address with let and const. And const is meant to be not really a true constant, because where it falls apart without going totally off the rails is that the idea here is that you will never reassign, and any linter will alert you to that. So if you're trying to reassign a variable to this, whatever it is, right? JavaScript is weakly typed, you can assign anything to it later, it won't let you. But where it becomes kind of gray area is if you go back here, if we're looking at this object at the top there, I can certainly, I don't know, you tell me, you may think that you can't change the properties. You can freely change the properties in the person's object. You know what I mean? So none of this is constant in here.
So
That's, the binding is constant. You cannot reassign to person. So I cannot come in here and say, you know, const, or I cannot do this 2 minutes later. I can't do, do that. Can't do that. That will throw an error. You cannot reassign. With var, you can do that. You know, and that's probably one of the biggest, you know, again, without going completely off the rail. But we have weekly typed in JavaScript. We can start off setting at, with an object, and then 2 minutes later we can throw a number in there. 2 minutes later we can throw a function in there. That's totally different than Java, right?
All right, thank you.
But that's why people always think true constants. Yeah, we also have that convention, but it's nothing really enforced. I don't think it's enforced in C# either. You capitalize just to show other developers, please don't mess with this value, or it's not meant to be messed with, but there's no enforcement really. But a lot of people think that, it's for a primitive like a string, if you can't reassign that, you can't change that, but it's totally different for any type of objects, arrays, any type of collections, arrays, objects, any type of functions, right? You can certainly reassign to that. Special types. So if you were to inspect them, they have an internal property. All these objects we just looked at, so we have object, we have an array here, we have a regular expression literal right there. Most of these, if you borrow from the toString prototype in here and you can feed it an object, it will give you the internal class. So internal is just a tagging mechanism. Don't think of this class as, like classes as in classes versus functional. This is more of a classification kind of thing. So it's a tag that these objects have that reveals their specialization. So it's an object specialized with a function. So it's a specialized object, but this will give it to you. There's no other way to really. That's why we're kind of not. I don't want to use the word abusing, but we're kind of using the toString to have access to that. There's really no other way. And there's no other reason to. In JavaScript, we use the double square notation to kind of say that it's an internal property, but it is tagged, and you. The bottom line is you can get to it, and it will tell you what it basically says. It's an object of function. It's a function object. So it reveals its specialty, if you will. More confusion here, though, right? Because we just said that these are not objects, and they are still being tagged like this. Right? It doesn't say. You see, it still says object undefined. Didn't we just say undefined and now are primitives? But yes, they are. We'll get to why that actually shows like that. And even here, that's a primitive. The last four are primitives. How do they come now back as object undefined, object string, object number? How is that? So in JavaScript, we have these. These are just the most common ones. There are plenty more. We call them natives, and as you can see here, they are built-in functions. Can be used. Some are used as constructors, meaning new string, new number, new booleans. Others, it doesn't really matter. Like for array, you can call it with the new keyword or without it. Symbol, you can actually get an error. I just learned that if you call it a new, there's no such thing as new for symbol. So it's all a little bit all over the place too, but that's the underlying mechanism to create these things. So one thing you'll notice that there's no native for null, even though, and there's also no native here on this list for undefined, right? Which goes totally against the grain of what we just saw here. Is there all these have natives right here, equivalent natives. If you run this, it seems like there should be one for undefined and null. There isn't. So correct me if I'm wrong, if I call like here, if I do this in just this part, right? If I do that in Java, if I call new string ABC, what do I get back? Do I get a primitive back?
I think that would construct an object, but like
That would construct an object.
I'm thinking for string. I don't know.
Here it does certainly. It'll construct. This is not the same as the literal form. So this will, and that's where people get confused as well. Here, using these, right? So here, I think. Is this scroll? Yes. So new string ABC creates we call that a wrapper object around the primitive value. It'll never create the primitive itself. And they're rarely used on primitives. But another point of confusion, if you do use that, it actually creates a wrapper. What's a wrapper object or a boxed object around the primitive value? So if we do this real quick here, just to straighten that. I think, can we put this back on the bottom? Yes, I can. Thank you. So if we do var A and then is new string, I give it ABC right here. And then if we do type of A, as you would might expect, it's object and not string. And then depending on the browser console, it will actually look something like this. And there we have an internal property again, and we have this double square brackets where it actually gives you the primitive value that has been wrapped or that has been boxed. Well, why is that important? Why is that useful? Let's see. So here is ours. Well, this goes back to the very first question. And I think that's the main confusion. That's why people may or may, from the outset, will say that everything in JavaScript seems to be an object. Because what do I have here? I have A clearly as a primitive. And then I can call a property, or I can call a method on that, on this number, which is also a primitive. What? So you gotta make up your mind, right? That seems to me that primitives are actually objects. That's the main culprit of confusion right there. And that's where the boxing comes in. The language actually, the minute you try to access this, will wrap it for you. You don't have to do anything in an object. I will box it, we say, for you to do that. I found a little nice thing that illustrates that. So if we look at this, so we have a string, we have a phone number here, right? Certainly a primitive right there. Now you're trying to get the length. You can certainly get the length of that. In order to do that, we need the primitive to be an object, right? How else would you get that length? So the minute you try to access that, that's where the native comes in. That's where it gets boxed. It passes through, converts it to an object just for that operation, to get you access to the length property. And you can barely see that. I don't think I can get rid of that. So at the bottom, can I? You can barely see it. So the minute that's done, phone number is a primitive again. So that gets quickly garbage collected right there. That it does not hold on to the boxed wrapper of string. It just gets rid of it right away, and in the next second, phone number is back to being primitive. So pretty much all this to just kind of explain why right? That's where I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. Like how you're telling me it's a primitive, you made that clear, but I can still call methods and methods and properties on it, which then seems to indicate that it's an object. After all, well, it's not really. It's still a primitive, but it gets boxed in time by the engine for you in order for you to succeed with whatever you're trying to do. And right, so here we take advantage of that all the time, right? Because nobody really uses new string or new boolean like here. You can call these natives and these constructors totally, but as we've just seen, these will not give you a primitive back. They will construct that wrapper that we just talked about. So you will get a primitive, you will get an object wrapped around that primitive. You will get a string wrapped around that ABC primitive. You will get a number wrapped around, object wrapper around the 42 and around the Boolean. And we have a way to get back to the actual native by calling value of. I've never had the need to do that, but you can. Back to here. Well, the last thing, there's boxing going on here. The minute you call toString on undefined, it boxes it to same way here, the same way there. And that's why it gets out to be object undefined, object string, object number. Even for these are I think it only does it for these because they don't really have natives. But object string, why is that? Well, because in order to do this operation, it has to be boxed again, and that's how you end up with it. Pretty much the most important one. That still does not change the fact, it doesn't change this, right? But every so often it gives you the illusion that this is not true. Right? But it's just the engine doing that constant boxing and unboxing for you. Well, without that, right, it's very useful. It's very useful, especially for strings. Not so much for numbers. There's a couple of, you can convert and all that, but for strings, to get, to split them, to extract certain parts of the string, to rearrange them, it's very, very useful. There's tons of utilities and strings on there. So without that, wouldn't be very useful language actually to do that. But in order to act on strings the way we want to, we have to box that stuff, and that's where it might seem that, well, we don't really do have true primitives by the circle. Questions? Is that helpful? At least for the ones that do work on JavaScript. So this setup, we have gone a little deeper than most on the subject, and than most will do, but not really crazy deep either. But this sets you up nicely for conversion. Like coercion in JavaScript is huge. Like explicit, implicit, going from one value to another. It's anybody in the room that has played with JavaScript, it does it for you in certain circumstances. Sometimes if you do it explicitly, well, you hopefully know what you're doing, but it happens most of the time for you. And in order to really wrap your, that's a much bigger topic than this, but to wrap your head around coercion or value conversion, which happens a lot, which you need to as a JavaScript developer, this sets you up nicely for that. Because once you know the ins and outs of the types, or at least going a little deeper, the conversion stuff will be easy. And then the other thing, probably, I don't know how it is in Java, but the idea of reference versus value copy, that's another topic that this sets you up nicely for. You know, anytime you're working in JavaScript, at least, you know, all primitives are passed as value copy. You know, versus objects, any type of collection is passed as reference. So comparing them comes into the mix. But once you make that, you know, again, it comes back to here. Once you know that these are objects, and in JavaScript, like with anything, it's such a dynamic language, which is great. You know, you can take that very, very far, but a lot of people, I don't want to use the word hate, but they right, that's why Flow exists, that's why TypeScript exists, right? Because they want to go the Java way, or any strongly typed language, because they think that's actually not a feature, right? That's a curse, then, you know, not having these strong types. But I, you know, me personally, whether, you know, for the good or the worse, like, I don't know any better, right? Like, I wouldn't even know, like, I can just reassign as, you know, and yeah, at times it rears its ugly head, but it also makes for a very dynamic, you know, programming environment, really. Yeah, pros and cons and everything, but, you know, Microsoft wouldn't sit down and spend all this time on TypeScript if that wasn't, you know, which is type JavaScript really was an extension on top of JavaScript that makes it, you know, type safe. If that wasn't, you know, and then, you know, especially the developer experience, that's, you know, that's as far as I've gone in. Like, you know, somebody mentioned Visual Studio Code earlier. Once you are in TypeScript, you get all this, you know, that the stuff that you are probably used to from IntelliJ or whatever you use in Java, where it knows, you know, everything. And as JavaScript developer, there's sometimes when I look at it, I'm like, ooh, you got all this rich. Well, yeah, because I know the type, you know, and that's all. So again, this sets you up nicely for that as well. Anybody wants to go deeper in this? These are the Bibles. I don't know if you've ever seen this. This is Kyle Simpson's series. This is 1 of 6, or maybe now 7. Just the name is nice too. You know, you don't know JavaScript, you don't know JS. It's all on GitHub. It's all for free. But I do encourage you to. You know, they're bite size, and this alone is types and grammar. So this comes, you know, so they're all divided into, you know, there's a one really small one to get you going, but then they have, you know, async has its own book, this keyword and objects has its own prototypes, has its own book, and this. But this, he is the guy that does like deep JavaScript kind of stuff, you know, very deep. You know, I don't think that he leaves any character unturned in these things. You know, very deep language stuff. You know, you're not going to find any React or any browser, you know, APIs in here or anything. It's strictly the language itself. You know, it's a very deep. I even saw it in an ad, in a job ad the other day. And I don't know how it found its way in there, but they wanted somebody that likes it. So yeah, fully Google it. You don't know JS, Kyle Simpson. It's all. You don't know JS is the title of the entire book series, and then every book, there's 6 or so of them, goes very deep on one specific subject.
Oh, what are some good projects, like for JavaScript beginners, or what were some of your first projects when you were starting out?
Simple things like building a quiz in the browser, right? That's a good thing. So you have, you know, you advance in the browser. You know, question 1, you know, 3 multiple choice answers, for instance. That's usually one that I always recommend, where you. Again, I don't know how it is in Java because it seems very simple, but to build that out properly. But you see, the first step is all right, spaghetti code everywhere. Like, you know, you mix UI with like logic and business law all in one, and I don't think it's bad, right? It's just an experience that almost, I think, you as a beginner, you kind of almost have to have. You almost have to see what kind of a mess you end up with, right? You almost need to see that is not sustainable for larger organizations. But if you Google JavaScript 30, there's like 30 projects with video walkthroughs by a guy named Wes Boss. He's also well known. He does JavaScript, you know, paid courses, but that's a free one. That's a great way, and it goes, I think it switches between Node, and most of the other stuff is browser-based, I believe. But that's another thing. That's another good reason to look at the language itself and not so get caught up with browser APIs. Maybe, right? Like if you know JavaScript, you can go Node, right? You can go totally in native, or APIs, or Mongo or whatever. This stuff is valid on that side. But yeah, or you say on the front end, really. For most of us, the glory days of jQuery are probably over, but it's still, you can do most of that natively. You still have to do the typical selection in the browser if you want to put a web app in the browser. And that's another thing, like try to stay away maybe from these frameworks or UI libraries as much as you can. Again, not so much like in a professional environment you're gonna have to, right? But to really learn JavaScript, that's another challenge. To try to use a small app and not use a library, right? And everything it has to offer you. That's another great way to get deeper into the language itself.
So the wrapper class is right. What would they be used for in JavaScript? Like other than other than that string example, because like in Java, we learned them when we were talking about abstraction, but like I don't know if there's abstraction in JS. So
yeah, you would. It literally happens for you, right? Anytime you use abc.length, it will do it. It just needs it to be an object. Like it's very. Now, very infrequently do you actively use these natives. Here, some of them you do, but certainly not string, number, boolean. These are only really used by that boxing internally. Yeah, you can use, and here, array and object, like you have, creating these literals is so easy, right? Why would you call the constructor on these? They produce the same thing. So what do I mean by that here? Why can you give me that? So So there's really no reason to ever do that, right? Why not just simply that's the literal form, right? It's so much more concise, so much more. The outcome is the same. Right? There's no boxing going on in here, but it's using the constructor versus using the literal form. It's the same, like especially with the function one that I showed you is the poster child of like the only thing. Where is it actually? The new function one.
I think it was in the code.
Yeah, it's in the code somewhere. So we can. This one right here, so that's the same. That's the equivalent to creating a function via. But that hopefully you can see the pain of this, right? Like why would you ever do that? But especially with objects, in JavaScript, I think we're somewhat spoiled in JavaScript that we can literally have these. You can literally say. And that's it, that's all you need for the literal syntax is so concise and so nice. Like I don't, I guess in Java I need the class first and all that, there's no such thing here. It's prototypical inheritance, it's not classical inheritance. So I can just like, I can mimic all of that. I can get there via prototypes and prototype chains and all the stuff. You can go really crazy on that. It has all these features, and I can mimic the classical, typical inheritance model, if I wanted to, but I can also, it's so dynamic that I can go, that I can go functional the other way just as easy. But I think here, as JavaScript developers, you never even think about it, right? That's how I need an object right now, I'm gonna create an object. I don't need a class first or anything like that. That we never think about that until you come across other, like more like Java, which I haven't done much in, but it's like, well, I need, need all this first. Like what? No, you just on the spot. And you use a literal. There's no need to use the constructor. You end up with the same thing, kind of, but it's so much more concise right there. But it kind of explains the boxing, right? That's why we need to know that these are around, because that's when they are being invoked by the engine itself, right? In order to, if you call a method or a property on a primitive, that's when this kicks in. It needs to get boxed around, and that's why they exist. So you could argue, right, that probably it's a decent statement to make that they're their only existence. Not all of them, right? Date, for instance, that's the only way to get a date, right? You have to call the constructor. Symbol too, no new keyword. Right? Function you never do. Well, why would you? Can, but function is it just serves as a learning tool or as an illustration tool that it is actually that these are all just subtypes of objects. But you're right, you bring up a good point. Some of them are heavily used and exclusively used. There's no date literal. There is a literal for regular expressions. Like I think it's on the slide somewhere here. So that's it's the same kind of thing. I think literal regular expressions is one of those cases where sometimes it's you do actually use one. You do use them quite equally. I have at least. In some circumstances, it does make sense to use the constructor versus the literal form. But anything, objects, arrays, pretty standard objects that you create isn't really there's no reason to really call any of these natives. But you have to know that they exist. You have to know how they function in order just to get your head around the fact what actually happens in that boxing and unboxing stage. So yeah, we answered it, right? It's not everything. Sometimes it seems that certainly I know why that question exists. It seems like from the outset that everything is an object mainly because of that implicit under the hood boxing and unboxing going on for you. But that's why we went this far, right? That's why we uncovered and figured out it's not. There's still primitives. They just get in order. You could argue you're asking for them to be used as object, right? How else would you be able to do dot length or toString or anything? I mean, at that point, you're an object length, but the language does it for you. It boxes it for the time being that you need to access and gets out. So I can certainly see why people would say truly everything is an object, but not really. Certainly, JavaScript wouldn't exist without object, as you can see. I mean, it is certainly. Most of it is, not all of it, but once you get deeper into it, whether it's given to you, whether you create it, I would say it is true that most of the language does revolve around objects, but that doesn't make everything an object. Is that stuff very different than Java? Somewhat different? I think the confusion comes from the JavaScript obviously borrows heavily from the C-like syntax, right, in Java, but that's some of it translates pretty, one-to-one, and other things are like they do they do very different things. So it's and then now with ECMAScript, we have a class keyword in JavaScript with ES6 now that's been around for a number of years. And some people say the only reason it was introduced is because Java programmer come to JavaScript because of its popularity in order for them to kind of feel more homey, right? Under the hood, there's still no classes in JavaScript. I mean, we can talk all night, but there is no classes. But they introduced that class keyword. It's still, it still goes via prototypes as it always has. They just added some syntactical sugar around it. And why? I don't know if that's true or not, because to make it easier for people that are used to classes to work in that environment. But that's how it's kind of interesting to see how it all kind of comes together. And it's certainly there's no question about it. But sometimes it does this very much similar thing, and other times it just goes totally different. But I think the main thing is probably the types, right? The types are purely, that's the main. That's probably still the main distinction, right? It's a strongly typed language, Java is, and will never change versus JavaScript is it's a wild west when it comes to types. So, like in your case, how much of a mental switch do you have to make? Like, is it just
not too much. Most of it does feel one-to-one. Coding from Java to JavaScript. Like I said, I'm still learning the basics of JavaScript, so I'm not way too far involved as I am in Java.
But having just creating a simple variable and not having to type it, is that weird or?
It's a lot faster. definitely a lot faster.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So you can't have it all, right? You want speed and convenience, or you want. I'll share my contact info. I'll share this stuff out if anybody wants to look at it. And I don't know if you guys ever come down to. Actually, at Oath we do host the JavaScript Jam CDJS meetup. It's pretty big, once a month. I think what is the first Wednesday? Second? I can never remember. What is it, first Wednesday?
I think so.
Second Wednesday? Yeah, I think it's it'll be first Wednesday of the month. It's actually at the Oath office in Canton. So. If you want to check out the office and come and see what the JavaScript community is up there and what they are up to. It's really pretty well, right? Very well attended, 40, 50 people always. Have some pizza, get some beer afterwards. Even if you come just for that. All right. Thanks for having me. Have a nice day.
Do you offer any beginner